So hi everyone, thanks for being here and thanks for giving time to listen out to an idea that we all collectively have. Um, and one of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about today is the idea of the seed lab. And this presentation and this time has really allowed me time to think about the etymology of the word creativity. And if you think about the word creativity, it comes from the Latin word creare, means to create or to grow. And quite aptly, I would say it's great to have all of you today so that we can talk about the seed lab further. So if you look at ecology and conservation today, and this is a paper that highlights the last 14 years of publications in leading conservation and ecology journals. And if you look at these clouds here, right, there is a change in focal interests as indicated in these clouds over time. One, in conservation, biology, and ecology. And more so, conservation, ecology, and biology now occupy distinct niches of sorts. In the next slide, you'll see that the same paper, machine read the full text of about 32,000 research articles published in 16 ecology journals and conservation biology journals. And they created a heat map. So they created a heat map of the topics covered in these journals. And they showed that conservation and society were important topics that were covered in the emerging discipline of ecology, in the emerging discipline of conservation biology that is rapidly changing. So now if you look in the next slide, specifically if a topographic map of the distribution of themes, which is to the right here, it's a two-dimensional topic space of the different topics in ecology and conservation. You see here at the intersections, right, where the dotted lines are, at the intersections, there are themes like habitat fragmentation, climate change, population statistics, review, and themes that are common links, not only to conservation and ecology, but one could argue to people in general. So, contrary to the perception that a lot of us hold that people are not interested in conservation biology and the idea of conservation, Zuzana Burlivova in 2018 published a paper in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, where she shows that contrary to the perception, there is public interest in conservation, and in fact it is rising over time across these different thematic groups. And this is despite the increasing political polarization, the reduced funding, and the deliberate misinformation campaigns that exist in the world today. And in the next graph, as part of the same paper, you can see that the frequency of the search word conservation is pretty high in a place like India compared to other places. So basically, the darker the blue, the higher proportion of internet searches for conservation relative to the total number of internet searches performed in that country between 2004 to 2017. And again, you can see it's pretty high given the intensity of blue in India. So what Zuzana and her colleagues argue is that we should try and tap into this growing interest and transformation that is happening not only in the public but within our fields to make conservation accessible and engaging in a relatable way. And in this talk, I'm trying to do these two main things. So I will outline, as scientists and communicators, the first part of my talk, what is required to create alliances and work together in the present day. And in the second part of the talk, I would like to highlight what is the action logic of the Seed Lab based on organized citizenship behaviors. And this also stems from the extensive work and learnings that I've had from citizens and people across the board who have also mainly been non-scientists, and what is the action logic that we can also reflect upon in our field as practitioners, as filmmakers, as researchers, trying to create alliances given the realities of our time. So the first thing is, in terms of present day alliances and present day realities, I often like to refer to this paper by this anthropologist, and the title of the paper is pretty relevant too. It's called "Why Scientists Succeed, Yet Their Organizations Splinter: A Historical and Social Network Analysis of Political Policy Advocacy and Conservation." So what Zone Nysa does is that she has done a larger ethnographic project where she's conducted a present-day social network analysis of scientists. And this also ties back to the history of repeated splintering in the Ecological Society of America. And she contrasts that with what exists with respect to how scientists and conservationists and researchers work today. So based on the survey of about 153, I think, attendees of the ICCB Congress, her results show, and this is part of her results in this network analysis, her results show that affiliations, right, that scientists hold, there are about 10 affiliations per respondent in this network, and which also includes advocacy-oriented activities. And this is much higher than what has been previously estimated in the literature. So despite the perception that you might be part of an organization, and that is your primary identity, in reality, most of us are also working at sub-organizational levels, or we also think that this organization that I work with only represents a very small part of what I want to do. I want to work in multiple other spheres. And that's exactly what her work shows. So this also suggests that individual researchers, people who are affiliated with organizations, are finding ways to informally jump across the science policy gaps at sub-organizational levels, right? So it's also a good reminder of sorts to organizations, institutions, to pay heed to being pluralistic in terms of being generous with your affiliation networks, because the picture of conservation and research today is very different from just a single NGO or just a single organization. The other challenge which sort of also exists for all of us is several personal developmental challenges. So especially in research and conservation, and I've talked about this in an SCCS talk before, there is Engelfield in his paper talks about urgent need to dispense with traditionally thought behaviors, especially with respect to self-interest, ego, and hierarchy that exists in our field. So that is one personal and developmental challenge that we need to think about. And we also need to think about environmental leadership, not only for research, but also more broadly. Like, so what are the relations, for instance, to ecological and moral issues, and give attention, rather than just giving attention to strategic, economic, and technical implications of what we do. And this is also something that I feel, in terms of some of the thinking that we can cultivate and some of the thinkings that might be applicable to our fields, is in the 70s and in the 60s, when a lot of institutions were formed, one could argue that there was a need for, and also when the industrial revolution was in place, one could argue that there was a need for instance, an elite guiding coalition of committed leaders who had lots of institutional power or were given institutional power by the political forces of that time, to force change through a system or force change through an organization. And today we see a lot of those remnants in the institutions that we are part of, or are associated with. Sometimes we see founder effects or senior scientists in NGOs and research institutions behaving in a certain way. We also see that there are lots of top-down institutional structures where there are leaders and followers rather than peers that are working on a one-to-one basis. And George Oduro and many others, in terms of ideas about leadership, they talk about the need to move away in the present times that we live in, to move away from post-heroic industrial era leadership to a more distributed level of leadership. So not only having to move away from this level, the different kinds of leaderships, we're also faced with lots of personal and developmental challenges as researchers, as practitioners, as filmmakers. A lot of us have to engage in non-traditional forms of training. One where in the systems we're part of don't allow for that. In many cases, they penalize you for developing such skills, because such skills are not only time sensitive, but they also take away from other work that you need to do. So there is a need for all of us to, for instance, develop facilitation skills, leadership skills, skills in psychology, communication, and arts. Also, given the multiple polycrises that we are seeing, there is a need for all of us to also have to take a personal, bring it all together in terms of understanding what the personal implications of these are to ourselves. So how do you hold many emotions together while being effort driven? And this paper by Marcus and Kitayama in 1991 on psychological review, I found this table very, very interesting, because I was just thinking about it as somebody engaged in science, as somebody who loves nature. There are so many feelings that you don't even know that you had a name for, that you're actually dealing with, and you're actually trying to name, you're actually trying to understand, all happening at the same time. So here there are, they list out 12 different feelings. And sometimes I think as researchers and conservationists, we're holding so many at the same time without, whether you're feeling sulky, whether you're also feeling a connection with someone who likes the same things as you, or level of familiarity. You're holding a lot of these things together. You're forming relationships, but you also don't know, how do I seek counsel? Do I need to seek counsel at all? So we also have a lot of personal developmental challenges that we face. And so just to summarize the first part of the talk, what I set out to ask was that as scientists and communicators and practitioners, what is it that is required to create alliances and work together in the present day? So the first point was that I think we could all agree that we would, the reluctant scientist is more or less now a myth. Most of us are engaged in some form or the other in our work, in our personal beliefs, in the intersection of our personal beliefs and our work. There is a moral dimension of leadership that we have to think about. We have to think about leadership being more distributed. And we also have to work on personal and developmental challenges. And so I come to the second part of my talk, which is what is the action logic of the seed lab based on organized citizenship behaviors. And I think the top part of this got cut out, but if you look at the top part of it, it's the title says that there is a rising tide of decentralized mass movements, right? And the graphic here more or less shows you what these decentralized mass movements look like. And we've seen this in multiple places, whether it's the Hingpatkai, whether it's Mole, whether it's Italin, rising tide of decentralized mass movements, which also have relational tipping points with respect to new forms of alliances that have been formed with respect to artists and communicators and multiple other bridges. But if you also look at this graphic at the same time, it's full of men that sort of look the same, which is not what I want to talk about as decentralized mass movements. So what I would like to envision as decentralized mass movements is, and not only not mass movements, but decentralized ways of organizing, whether it is for research and not really for movements, is how do we think about being pluralistic? How do we think about being inclusive? And this art by this boy from 12th standard, his name was Zidane, who worked with an illustrator from Bengal, Swanand, is quite illustrative of what I mean as decentralized leadership. And another idea of decentralized leadership, and I just want to arrive at this from multiple ways of looking at the world. So because talking about some of these concepts can also sound a bit nebulous. So one was an idea of, if you look at what Zidane and Swanand produced, is what I find beautiful about the idea of decentralized leadership. The other idea is the idea of Anubandh that Ella Bhatt, the noted Gandhian, talks about, where she says Anubandh is a net of mutuality. So we can say that, okay, I want to work on this one aspect, but we're all part of this net of mutually beneficial communities. So Anubandh is also an idea of decentralized leadership that we see. Another way of looking at leadership is to maybe look at leadership through the eyes of trees and tree mapping. So this book by Manuel Lima, which visualizes branches of knowledge, is a very beautiful book among many other things. And the book takes you through different ways in which you can just map the world. And I will present some examples later. But the reason I would like to use trees is that one is that maybe some abstractions in terms of what you think about the seed lab could have a strong resemblance to trees, a way of depicting trees allows for space efficiency. It allows for pictorial strength in terms of the beauty, and allows you also to magnify your focus on certain aspects of the tree. So I would take you all through about 3-4 examples of basically tree mapping and thinking about leadership. So in the first tree, which is the figurative tree, this is a tree that we're all actually very used to seeing. And this is a tree where if you actually had to think about it, you always think, okay, what is the central focus? And that central focus is only feeding the rest of the other branches, but the central focus is what is most important. And in this tree, like for instance, the tree of consanguinity, the way it is depicted and the way it's been used over time, it's is used to depict very rigid sort of rules that were necessary, or one could argue were necessary for certain parts of societal functioning. And this was a tree that covered the explicit conditions of marriage. So who could you marry? Who could you not marry? There would be parts in different parts of the tree. And so this is a tree that serves to be very rule based. But what I would argue for the seed lab is, can we think of getting together? Can we think of collaborations that moves away from either from top down or just from one place that feeds up to other multiple directions? So can we think of trees as icicle trees? So for instance, this is our space. Maybe our space is wildlife conservation and livelihoods, right? And can we think of icicle trees where there is an agency area? There are different adaptations to this space that are depicted in multiple ways, that are grouped by category. Can we think of the way we come together as sunbursts, where we radiate outwards and we expand outwards? So this is an example of nature photography and the different kinds of nature photography and the sub branches that come out from those different kinds of nature photographies. Can we think of how we come together and our work as multi-directional trees? So this is a very nice example of a multi-directional tree where there are taste buds, and your central premise here is greens and salads, right? So what best goes with baby spinach, what best goes with beetroot, what best goes with broccoli, and you have the subclasses there, and it expands outwards. And that is also how we could think of models of organizing. Can we think of trees, and this is an example that I really like, as interactive? So for instance, people were asked, when you think of the word make, the visual, when you think of the word make, what do you associate it with? So not only what do you associate it with, but what are a branch of related words that move out from there, and you grow out from there. So you blossom with meanings, you blossom with relationships. So could that then, does this all lead, and can this all lead to a possible way to define the seed lab, where the seed lab, to borrow from Yuvan work, writings on cooperative pedagogy, where can the seed lab seek to distribute power, knowledge, and focus among multiple people, multiple species, so that we're able to push our own disciplinary boundaries, re-articulate support across institutions, and connect and collaborate, right? And while all of this sounds very exciting, and if you had to look at, so if you had to look at an optimism gradient on the x-axis, where one could argue, okay, maybe we're all tired. Some of us are here, some of us are saying, okay, things are changing. But some of us also know, and also most of us, I would argue, would also think that, hey, you know what, we can do certain levels of things, like we can work together and engage more, and we also start to feel more optimistic. But there's also the reality that, you know, when we think about great collaborations and we think about large scales, about how we're going to change the world, it often leads to a level of fantasy, right? Where you feel optimistic about a certain level of things, but there is no collaborations, no work that happens, and we all start blaming each other, right? So what McAfee and all say in their paper, Everyone Loves a Success Story, Optimism Inspires Conservation Engagement. They propose 5 steps. And I think I won't get into the first 3 steps, but I think the 4th and the 5th step are what are important to what we're thinking. So the 4th step is, yes, we're optimistic and say, okay, let's come together and let's work in a particular way. But what is a pathway that is forward, that we can use, that moves us forward? And how is it that we can create a community spirit? And one of the ways, taking from step 4 and step 5, And one of the ways I feel that we can work and create a path forward is figuring out an actionable model, right? So many people argue that, yes, we know there are certain things that need to change, but how do you actually do it? And many people argue the way to bridge the knowing to doing gap is to think about what is the kind of model of change that you're talking about, right? And the first, so what Lauren Mohammed proposes is that when conservation scientists and policymakers address their findings and recommendations, we usually do it as to whom they may concern recommendations, where we say, oh, there is some policy that needs to change, or local communities need to be involved. Yeah, and what they say is that it sounds grand, but it obfuscates from the crucial issues of agency. So who exactly needs to do it? And they call it the hathrological model, which says that it comes from the Greek word of hathros, which means large groups. And large groups indicating that the people of the city are one large group, but when in reality we are not one large group. So they argue that basically conservation needs to enter the fray where there are concrete actors, there are structural links, there are power dynamics that we expect shape certain biodiversity outcomes, and must be investigated further. And many of these can be done on a case-by-case approach by engaging in specific field situations and reflecting in a particular practical manner on what are some approaches that we can use to bridge the conservation knowledge to action gap. So there are 4 different models that Laurent Mermet and colleagues put forth. The first model is something that a lot of us will already be familiar with. The first model is the government could be an actor. So the idea is that the government sets agendas, decides on prioritizing of conservation amongst conservation issues. Policy design rests on the sound knowledge of what the government has and policy evaluation. So that's the government as the operator model. The second model is, a lot of you will also be familiar with this, is the governance process. And if you look at Elinor Ostrom's work on governing the commons, it's a very influential example of this model, where rules between resource managers themselves determine how they manage a common pool of resources, right? The third model is what is called the Zellick model, or the model of conservation, where change cannot rest primarily on the government, nor on a circle of majority where there is existing power. So in this model, the Zellick model, there is a conservation or a public concern that can be defended on its own grounds in the face of all other challenges. So say if you were interested in saving the black-necked crane, the Zellick model argues that this can be defended on its own ground in the face of all other species also being threatened, right? And the Zellick model also works on saying that, we can't create large-scale changes in terms of the government as the operator, or we can't create large-scale changes in terms of like disruptions, which is the fourth model that I will come to, but we can work on time-sensitive policy windows, right? So coming to finally, I'll just wrap up with the last model, which is the Stasek model, where political economic regimes are seen to be the main source of the problem, as they act to perpetuate dysfunctional activities and political and power relations that are seen to be the root cause of biodiversity loss. So in this model, one could also argue that there are certain political revolutions that are required in terms of how we work that would serve biodiversity well, and in many cases one could argue might serve biodiversity the best. Is the static model. So figuring out the actionable model is that the Seed Lab thinks about our work as not either of these three, but the one highlighted in bold, while not also saying that we don't have other affiliations or we don't work in other ways at an individual capacity or recognize the need for other groups to do so in these three other ways. So if we were to say that the Seed Lab works on the minority for change or the ZELIC model, it is important that we also understand, using Laurent Mermet's framework, we understand what are the organizational relations and what are the organizational questions that we also need to ask ourselves. So who are we expecting to act? And at what level are we expecting to act? So maybe we could argue based on the document that we have all sort of co-written and co-produced, that we are expecting to act at the site and the regional level. Who is expected to lead? So if some of the points that I made were compelling enough, I think decentralized leadership would be one expectation of leadership. Who should be prioritizing concerns in terms of prioritizing concerns with accountability. So a lot of these concerns and a lot of these accountabilities, one could argue, should come from the bottom up. So for instance, there are fellows and a lot of, I will come to this in the next slide, a lot of fellows, mud on the boots practitioners, a lot of people who are embedded in site level work, know that there are certain questions and a certain level of help that is required in the field. So can we prioritize these concerns and help out in these ways? Using some of the fellows networks, I think Nei Jamo is here today. She's one of the Sanctuary Mud on the Boots coordinators, who also says that there are Mud on the Boots fellows who need certain help. And also there are people involved in long-term work at their sites, which throws up questions of alliances needed and throws up questions of work that is needed. So can we prioritize those concerns of embedded site work? And finally, can we also ask, what is the place of specialization? And this is not to say that there is no place for specialization. There is actually a deep need for specialization to fit into some of these organizational questions, and also a place for housework, or a place for, general levels of work that is required among us. And today is a good example of Rohit, Anuja, and a lot of them coming together to put together this talk for us. So what is that level of embeddedness that is required to help us answer some of these dynamic questions? So like, what causes biodiversity loss? What actions could address biodiversity degradation? And given that a lot of us have a lot of privilege in terms of our education, in terms of our backgrounds, in terms of our majority status, in terms of our gender, what are privileged forms of action that could be envisaged? And coming to some of the themes from the field, these are some of the themes from the field that have emerged from a Green Hub reflective workshop that was held in January on what were some of this, what were some of the site level questions and what was the site level help that was required. So these are a list of some of the themes that have come from the field. And if any of you here would like to help out in any of these matters, for the moment, please do email me and then we can take it forward in terms of just figuring out the housework of where and how we can get to this. So I'll just go through this one by one. So these are also things that we can discuss between us to figure out, okay, what are more themes that we can put forth and find ways where we can work together, involve others to help out in these ways. So for instance, in Karbi Anglong and in Changlangshu in Nagaland, there are some restoration and there are some restoration efforts going on. But unfortunately, the fellows there need feel that they need a level of hand holding to understand, okay, how do they monitor mortality? How do they monitor some of their success? So they need a level of mentorship and a level of hand holding in that. There were other themes that were interesting that came around with respect to elephants. And this is something I think Arjun, Shraddha and Leona will talk about later. And some of the things they were interested in was how can we think about recreational elephant chasing in Sonitpur? What is the sort of effective communication we can build around that to develop vocabulary, develop imagery, to develop communication around recreational elephant chasing? How do we think about mahout training and management of captive elephants further? Anuja and others also thought about how can we get more Assamese researchers for turtle conservation. Some of the Singchung Bugun village community reserve staff thought about, asked for a workshop on if there is a fire in the forest, what is it that we can do best? Who do we contact? How do we go about dousing a fire? So are there any skills with respect to that? Several doctors from around Pakke felt the need to engage with the forest department and other practitioners to think about if there were snake bites, what should you actually do? There was, again, this came from the field, from certain people like Rimung and others. How do we think about nature education at different sites? There was also a small group, and I'm going to talk about that later, that felt that it's important to develop workshop material on diversity, equity, and inclusion for Mud on the Boots fellows for the Sanctuary Asia program. I have another colleague of mine, Ram, who's an artist who has a dream of thinking about fantastical creatures of Pakke, and he's never, because he has a disability, he's not able to go into the forest, but he wants to put this out to anybody. He wants to put this out as an exhibition or as a book, and that is also work that is also a theme that has arrived from the field. And on this group, and if there are any other themes that arrive, I know that there will be a long laundry list of things that need to be done. This would be a great way to put it together on the Google Doc. And more importantly, how do we also think about what we can do and what we can plug in to to fill some of these gaps. And so, coming to the last few slides, what we have worked on so far is many people on this group have been part of 6 major working groups. So there's a communication working group, one of which today has, and feel free to, if you're not on any working group, if you'd like to be in part of another working group, if you'd like to fill a space by creating another working group, please feel free to do that. So like the communication working group today has put together this talk for us. It's also planning to get us all together on Slack, form reading circles. There's another Creative Commons working group that is planning to put together photo competition and have Creative Commons classes for the Green Hub Fellows, maybe also end up having a wiki chapter where we can populate Wikipedia articles with just flora, fauna of Northeast India. So there's a Creative Commons working group that has come together with Josna, Chandan, and Jolie leading it. There's also an educational working group, and I'm sure Nayantara will be working on this, and I'm sure she will also take us through some of her ideas in the next few weeks or next few months. But the idea of the education working group is how can we create digital textbooks? And this was an idea I think Arjun, Tejaswini, and some others had. How can we create digital textbooks based on some of the material that fellows have collected from the field? How can we create digital textbooks for fragmentation, for conflict, for other relatively difficult topics to understand? What are training manuals, and can we have trainings that happen at the level of the site? So Sanya, I don't know if Sanya is here today, but Sanya is on behalf of NCL. She's going to be putting our teacher training program together, where there will be 10 different practitioners that we can select that can be part of a nature education workshop that they can implement at their site. There are also people who have written, who are in the process of writing seed grants together. So Rimung and Manisha are writing a seed grant on nature education that they would like to pursue in Labukor and other places as part of the Red Panda range. In terms of the art and design interface, there has been some work on nature interpretation centers in Pakke and Eagle Nest, but we never got to the nuts and bolts of, creating estimates. So we finally have an estimate if there's any forest department, or if there's any community that would like to set up a nature interpretation center, how much would it cost, and what are the timelines, and what is the portfolio that we have from other sites. There is an idea to have a blog. And again, all of us would appreciate any comments you have on the feasibility of having a blog or not having a blog. So that's the art and design. There's also, I think, Tejaswini and a few others are working on design sprints. So can we have design sprints for artists in like a workshop in SCCS to say, if you were interested in wildlife conservation, these are a set of resources that you could, or a set of exercises that you could start to engage with. And then finally, we have the elephant working, sorry, I've missed these two, but we have the elephant working group that is working on a range of things. And I won't talk about this a lot because I know Arjun has volunteered to give a talk sometime. And maybe he could just cover a short bit on what they would like to do, but basically covering captive elephants, recreational chasing, and also using some of the Green Hub material on films to develop an internship module with Hathi Bondu. And finally, here, there's a small diversity, equity, and inclusion working group that would like to, like I was saying before, would like to develop a 2-day workshop on what would inclusion look like. So while there are these different working groups, and I'm sure there will be others based on the interests that people have, what I feel is most important is this bit, is what are the values that we stand for, and what are the values that hold all of us together. So in the Seed Lab document also, I would highly encourage all of you, and a lot of you have already contributed to writing some bits of this values out quite explicitly. So I also know that we have done this for the My Mole campaign, where sometimes we get trolled, so we have very, very explicit values. So on the days you get trolled, you often feel the urge to react. So one of our values is that we all get 8 hours of sleep, and we only respond if need be after those 8 hours of sleep. So even having explicit values, I think, always helps. And then just thinking of such organized citizenship and such organized behavior is obviously challenging, because one has to deal with a wide variety of situations at once, right? We also have to integrate different levels of reality with respect to the site, what is important. There are also very important long and short-term challenges that we need to think about. So if we were to say, yes, let's all work through this model, a long and short-term challenge would also be, unless you have work to show, how do you also raise money? How do you also raise support? How there are often also in such frameworks, there is a certain value that non-traditional roles play and housework plays, right? And those values might be equivalent to writing a first author paper, if not more. But how do you compensate for these non-traditional roles that we often have to play? And there are certain risks also. So there's a risk of scattering managerial and organizational efforts. There's a risk of losing touch with your primary vocation of the organization. And there's also a risk that maybe if all of this doesn't work out, 5 years later, you might, a scientific institution might not want you. And there is also an extreme rarity of alchemists who are able to put all of these things together to make things work. And some of the internal and collective ponderings I've also been thinking about is, can coming together be thought about simply? Like, are we able to think about what are the vertical connections that we have? Say I was part of an organization and I didn't know a different part, and then through the seed lab, I knew somebody. So that is a vertical connection that I have established that can be quantified. There was a person in a site, or there's a horizontal level of engagement that I'm doing with fellows, or horizontal level of engagement I'm doing with respect to the embeddedness of the community. Has that expanded? Are there small halo projects? Like, are there lots of very small but cool things that we can do that, give you a halo or make you feel good? Or some people feel like, hey, that's a cool project that we could do in our sites, even though they might not have large scale changes. And is there also an emergence of meaning that can come together in terms of, is there an emergence of meaning, for instance, on what are collaborations versus partnerships, right? So can our coming together be thought about in these ways? It's also important to think about, what does failure and success look like? So this is an idea that could very much fail. And I'm sure this is not given that there's biodiversity collaborative, that work at much larger scales and with a lot of money. What does failure and success look like in both these situations? Do we not also want to overexpand? Do we want to be self-contained? So it's important to think about that. And can we also have beacons that remind ourselves that, we want to create spaces, we want to be people that are natural, vibrant, and feel like we are doing vital work, and see how we want to use or expand the Zelic model among ourselves. And then finally, if I just had all these different seeds and fruits cut out from Pakke, and finally, if I just had to think about the idea of the seed lab, it would definitely be that of cooperative pedagogy, maybe an emergence, maybe a relational tipping point of an idea whose time has come, things that can give you small halos, where the community, and we feel proud of small things that we do, things that help in horizontal expansion, in terms of connectedness, and things that sort of, and an idea that makes us feel awake, nimble, agile, where there is value in motion, in getting things together. There's value in process, and you're not also overcommitting, and you're not also saying, hey, this is something that is going to last forever. This is something that I'm only going to do, but you're always going to keep this out, have a watch for this on the corner of your eye. And we're always going to try to see, okay, how do we get things going? I'm happy to take any questions, or yeah, I'm happy to take any questions or any thoughts, ideas.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, when you talk about decentralizing, institutional structures, when you talk about um, the governmental structure being a very top-down kind of institution, right? There is what you're advocating with the seed lab. You're advocating the seed lab is a much more decentralized. Uh, what do you see the challenges being there? I mean, how does that? How do you make sure that as the organization grows, it does not devolve into something that is unmanageable?
So that's also very important to think about, in terms of, I think it's also important to think about the scale. So for instance, at this stage, one could argue that the Seed Lab is not an organization, and it isn't. But it is an organization but it is an entity that can grow. So it is very important to think about scale. And I think that would also be important to think about it in the document. So for instance, there are some ideas about scale that have emerged from Sumana's Kolagi's work in Karnataka, where he is a Gandhian who says that organizations above 40 people stop making impact in terms of what their original intent was. So that is a very good point. And I would also say that is something that we need to think about, and something that is very realistic. So as organizations grow, many people say, okay, I have 100 employees versus an organization or a collective that has 20 to 30 people. I think that is something that we need to think about quite critically in terms of the working groups that we form and what is it that is there. I would welcome any thoughts on that too.
No, I was not asking specifically in the context of the seed lab. I was just thinking about organizations that become large and then they become very modular, right? And they become modular such that you have groups of people who are doing certain things, but then again, they're not talking across groups. And it's that failure of collaboration. It's that lack of collaboration, lack of new ideas being exchanged across these modules, even though the affiliation is the same, that then stops becoming effective. So I was just thinking about that in this context.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. And I think that idea of having a space that is natural. So this is also something I forgot that was quite critical and important to my talk, is that from October or November onwards, by the side of Green Hub, there will be a space where anybody who would like to come and just sit there, give a talk, meet fellows, understand, okay, if you're planning a research project, if you have any students, or if you would like to sit in that space, I would like to create a space that allows for that flexibility, agility, and that nimbleness where you're able to talk, you're able to figure out, and it also feels naturally easy and vibrant. Any other questions? Any other thoughts?
Hi.
Hi.
I actually have a question. Can you elaborate a little bit on the what is it, the reading circles, and what were you thinking about there, or is that for a later talk?
Can I actually pass that on to Anuja and Rohit in the spirit of decentralized, because I don't know yet what. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, so the idea behind the communication working group, the reading circles and stuff is still slightly is evolving. But the broad idea is that people across different niches of work can come together and share interesting idea, and then people might get new ideas for their own work and they can collaborate. So it's like this platform where basically where we exchange ideas across a uh, diverse spectrum. Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions? And part of the Seed Lab also, I didn't get to spend a lot of time on that, is like there are several people who have been collaborating among themselves. Like I know Arjun, Shraddha and Leona have been writing certain small grants with respect to elephant conservation that they would like to pursue. So that is also something that that we could pursue, or we could get together and figure out in smaller groups. So if there are no further questions, I will pass it on to Rohit to wrap up then. And thank you everybody for hearing me out. And yeah, please feel free to work on the Google document, share ideas, email, and be in touch.
Yeah, so I have two announcements. One thing is that the next Seed Lab talk will be on June 2nd by Umesh on climate change, forest degradation, and how birds are responding to these. So I hope everyone will be there for that. And the next thing is that we encourage everyone to participate in these talks, or at least give suggestions for who we should invite for the subsequent talks. That's all.
Cool. Thank you, Rohit, and thank you, Anuja, and thank you everybody for having us. And yeah, we look forward to meeting on the 2nd of June. And if anybody, like what Rohit was saying, would like to give a talk, do get in touch with him. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
Good talk.